15, so they're having questions like, what does it feel like to be in labor? And so we'll have you guys just share your birth story, how it went, and then we'll have some Q&A.
Yeah, actually, I started our very last Bradley class that we had. I started that night contracting. So it was about 1:30 in the morning, and I woke up because I felt a little bit wet, and I didn't know like what was going on. And it was a very small amount of like leaking. No, it was a really light tint, like light color to it. So it wasn't like a huge mess or anything, but I noticed that it wasn't. I was pretty sure that something was going on. But it was 1:30 and I was feeling those contractions. And I actually started feeling contractions at the Bradley class, but they were so minimal that I didn't really worry about it. And I hadn't felt any contractions prior to this, so I thought I was going to be late for sure. And so I didn't even bother waking Cody up. But of course, instead of going to bed like I should, I was all excited. So I stayed awake until he woke up in the morning, and I was still having like kind of mild contractions. And I told him, well, I think this is it, because I was still bleeding just a little bit. But you go to work, and we'll just kind of see what happens. And so he did go to work, and he would check in on me every 15, 20 minutes, send me texts, how things were going. And he came home at noon, and that's when my contractions were about 9 minutes apart, I think. Yeah, about 9 minutes apart, but they were going back and forth so much, and sometimes I would go a little bit longer, and sometimes they were shorter, that we would just, we're like, okay, well, let's relax. And he brought me some Mexican food, which was a mistake. Don't get Mexican food. Don't do it. So, and we were watching a movie, and we would just time the contractions, and we were trying to be really relaxed about it. And we didn't actually end up going to the hospital until about 9:30 that night, and that was when my contractions were about 4 minutes apart. And it was hurting. It was uncomfortable, really, really uncomfortable.
And we tried really hard to stay home as long as we possibly could.
We did.
There were a couple times where we wanted to go, but we
we're like, okay, we'll stay as long as we can, and as long as I can handle it. And by the time we got in the car, I was like, we waited too long. This is gonna hurt. Like I knew I was gonna have a few contractions on the way to the hospital. It was gonna be really uncomfortable. But we got to the hospital, and we hadn't filled out our paperwork prior to, like our admit forms, which I totally recommend doing, because when you're like 4 minutes apart and in labor, the last thing you want to do is sign anything. You're just so I was like on all fours with my head on the chair, like trying to breathe. And she's like, "Oh, she's in labor right now." We're like, "Yeah."
Yeah.
Pretty intense.
So we had to like sign the paperwork like with the contractions. We'd get everything ready, and then she'd finish the contraction. She'd hurry and sign everything.
And then I'd have another contraction. So they took us into triage, and it felt kind of like a relief to be there finally. And I was all excited, and the contractions were still coming. And they checked me in triage, and that's actually when my water completely broke. So it had been leaking a little bit, and we felt like we would be okay to just let it leak a little bit as long as it wasn't anything excessive. So it completely broke while I was in triage. So they thought that was the first time my water had broken. So we had a little extra time, which was nice. And unfortunately, I was only dilated to a 3. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. So we went into our room, and Cody kind of set it up and made it comfortable. And then we just started working on the business of labor. And I would get up and walk around. The thing that's really nice at Banner Gateway is they have monitors that are wireless, so they can put the monitors on, and you can move around as much as you want, which was really, really nice. So I got to get up and move around, and we were so lucky. We got the greatest nurse. And we had given our birth plan to our doctor, and he had forwarded already and sent it to the hospital, and we had a couple copies on us. But I really think that when they knew that we were coming in, they just picked a nurse that would be, at the time, would be good for us. And she was just awesome. Like if I was on the floor and she needed to do something, she'd get on the floor with me. And so we had her for the whole night. So we didn't have to worry about different nurses coming in and out.
When we actually never left the room, we envisioned that we would be walking around and going into the garden and using all these different things. But once we were there, we were so far into labor that we pretty much just stuck to the room.
We didn't really do anything else. And because my water had already broken, we didn't get to use the tub. They had this awesome jacuzzi tub thing there. It's all zen and nice. And we didn't really get to use that, but we definitely utilized the exercise ball, and they had a squat bar that they attached to the bed, which was awesome. It was great. And and she was really familiar with natural births, so she was able to kind of give us some advice sometimes if we needed it. And if Cody was coaching me, she didn't even interfere with it. She was very quiet and soft-spoken. It's like, our nurse was so awesome. She was the greatest. So we got really lucky there. And
Are you guys planning on doing it in a hospital or at home or a birth center?
hospital, yeah. And we had a really good experience with it, so we got really lucky. Our doctor, the doctor we chose was he's very medical. Like, he really believes in medicine, but he was really, and that's why we liked him, actually, because we're like, hey, if the job needs to get done, he can do it. He knows what he's doing. He's been doing it for 18 years, and we're like, okay. But he was supportive of what we wanted to do, and so we really liked that. And he was really honest about what he felt like he could do versus what he wasn't going to do. So we knew that when we got in the hospital, we weren't going to get a doctor that said suddenly, like, no, you can't do that. So, because he'd been honest from the beginning. So the most important thing was that Cody was there with me the whole time, and that we did it without any medical intervention. Those were the things that were the most important to us, and that everybody was, relatively safe. And I think the baby's heartbeat was strong the entire time I was in labor, so they didn't really push anything, and they weren't too worried about it.
So was it 2 a.m.?
It was at 2 a.m. that I was fully dilated and effaced. And that's when we started. She's like, okay, if you feel like pushing, let's go ahead and push. And it feels better to push. So when you're ready to push, be excited about that, Mark, because it does actually feel better to be able to push. And so we started pushing at 2. And I don't know if the nurse just didn't catch it, or our doctor wasn't on call, so there was a different doctor there. And he went home, I think around 1:30, said to call when we were ready. And around 2 o'clock we started pushing, and I don't think anybody really worried about calling him because we thought it would be a while. So I think it wasn't until our doctor came in at 5:30, our doctor came on call at 5:30, and he came in to check on me, that he saw that the baby was turned the wrong way. And so they had to turn him.
Well, what had happened is he was at a +1 station, and he was like that for a really long time. And then finally, by the time our doctor came in, because there was the on-call doctor, and then that switched over, and our doctor came in, and he says, "Oh, well, he's not progressing because he's face up." And so he just said, "Okay, hold on," and turned him, and that was
I came off the bed.
She was really tough. But we were grateful that he just went ahead and did it.
I came off the bed. He was holding one side, the nurse was holding the other, and in between screaming my head off, I was like, "Dr. Hewish, could you please stop, because I don't think I'm going to make it. Like, please don't do this." And then he'd do it again, and I'd scream. But that was probably the most intense part, even more than the contractions and everything. So do your pelvic tilts a lot.
And that's the other thing, is we had thought about getting him in the right position a lot prior to actually going to labor. But then when we were in labor, by the time we got to the hospital, she was so uncomfortable that she wasn't moving around a lot. It was getting to the bathroom was a chore, so we didn't move around as much as we had envisioned. And so we actually should have been doing pelvic tilts when we were at home, getting in the right spot. But we were busy trying to relax.
Yeah.
So, let's see, he turned in, and then he dropped to a +2, and then he stayed there for another
hour or so.
hour.
And that's when we were like, okay, we probably need some intervention.
And at that point, the doctor said, we can use the vacuum, and if we use the vacuum, you still have enough energy to help push. But if we wait